Hello students, welcome to the MEMONEET. Myself Ritik Sir, your biology SME. So in the last video, I have mentioned or I have completed the living world, right? So where I have given a brief explanation in just one short video about the entire important topics or important aspects in the living world chapter. So now today also the same thing. That means in this video also, I'm going to cover the entire syllabus in one shot where I'm going to cover the most important, topics which are being asked in your previous NEET. So those topics I'll be concentrating, and I'll try to cover the entire slot in just one video, so that this could help you with the revision part and all. So in the biological classification, what all the things that I'm going to cover is about the basic, what are the kinds of kingdom, and you have five kingdom classification where I'll be explaining you about the kingdom Monera, Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. With that additional, there are separate, there are certain organisms which have been grouped separately. So what are those? They are viruses, viroids, prions, and lichens, right? So these things also I'm going to explain and the importance. Yes. So what was the very first attempt of the classification was actually being done by the Aristotle. So Aristotle was the very first who attempted very earlier. He attempted in a most scientific base of the classification. So what he did is he just used a simple morphological characters to classify the living organisms. Like he classified the plants and animals. So he classified the plants based on their morphological appearance, like trees, shrubs, as well as herbs. So he also divided the animals into two groups. They were like cold-blooded animals as well as those which did not had red blood. Sorry. So one animals belongs to the group red blood, and those animals which did not had red blood, right? So they were grouped in the separate class, separate group. So later on, this did not found convenient, and we had the Linnaeus, okay, who came up with this two kingdom system of classification, where he gave the plantae and animalia were being classified. So was also being developed where including all the plants and animals were being clearly classified in their respective group. So this system, even became very complicated when it did not distinguish between the eukaryotes as well as prokaryotes, unicellular and multicellular organisms. And also there were certain photosynthetic, that is like green algae, and there were again some fungi which were non-photosynthetic organisms. So that means plants, basically the respective thing is all the plants, they actually do photosynthesis, right? So they perform photosynthesis to prepare its own food. But there were some fungi organisms, they were non-photosynthetic in nature. So that he failed to explain these all things. So later on, what happened? Again, the classification was attempted. So now, when I'm talking about this, the classification of organisms into plants and animals were easily done and was easy to understand. But large number of organisms did not got fit into these two classification. Hence, two kingdom classification also got failed. So later on, it was R.H. Whittaker in 1969, very important. R.H. Whittaker in 1969, he proposed the five kingdom system of classification. So where he had defined that he had this five kingdoms, one is kingdom Monera, Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So the main criteria for the classification was used by him includes that cell structure, body organization, then mode of nutrients, that is its food, then reproduction mode, as well as phylogenetic relationship, that is ancestrally relationship. So earlier, the classification system includes the bacteria, blue-green algae, fungi, mosses, ferns, and gymnosperms and angiosperms. These all things were being placed under the kingdom fungi plant itself. But later on, they were made separately. Like they brought together that the prokaryotic bacteria and the blue-green algae with other group which were like eukaryotes. So they also group together the unicellular organisms as well as the other group like multicellular organisms. Like what do you say that? Say you have Climadomonas and Spirogyra. So they were placed together under the kingdom algae. So then the classification did not differentiate between the heterotrophic groups like fungi, which normally depends on other organisms, right? And other autotrophic green plants, which are able to prepare its own food. So here heterotrophs are nothing but they depend on other organisms for their food. Where autotrophs are auto means they are able to prepare their own food. Okay, they do not depend on other organisms for their food, something like that. So those that means they are not going to get the nutrients from other organisms, basically. Okay. So through they also show a characteristic differences in their cell wall composition. Like the fungi, they have the cell wall is actually chitin in their wall, while the green plants will be having what kind of cell wall the green plants will be having? Cellulose cell wall, right? So this is another very important thing. That's why they in plant all were not included in plant. Again, the classification happened. So where some of the organisms were came as different kingdom, like fungi, kind of that, and bacteria, kind of. So all prokaryotic organisms were grouped together, while the kingdom Monera, uh, which are actually unis kingdom Monera, under the kingdom Monera. That means all the prokaryotic organisms, right? That means the organisms which are single cell in nature. So they were brought together in the kingdom Monera, whereas unicellular eukaryotic organisms were, brought in the kingdom Protista. Like fungi. So then the second Protista, then later on again there were other kingdoms like fungi, then Plantae, Animalia, like this, they have divided. So kingdom Protista had brought together the Climodermus as well as chlorella, which was early, it was been placed in the kingdom algae within plants, and both it has cell walls and all. They were brought to the kingdom Protista based on its all the appear characteristics. With the Paramecium and amoeba, which was early placed in the kingdom Animalia, so they also have they normally lack cell wall, right? Like the same thing. Those were also brought to the Protista kingdom. Next. First thing is we are going to learn about the kingdom Monera. So kingdom Monera, they are most abundant microorganisms that you are going to find almost everywhere. So they also live in the extreme habitats such as where you cannot imagine even a life. For example, they normally live in hot springs, deserts, snow, deep oceans, where even a few other life forms cannot survive. So many of them live in or on other organisms. That means they live in the organism inside the host, or they live on the organism. So they're actually called as parasitic mode of adaptation can be seen in some of the kingdom Monera. So they are called as parasites. So most of them, like the bacteria, they come under the group. Okay. So again, in bacteria, there are four categories based on their shape. So one is spherical in shape. So when I'm talking about the spherical in shape, example is coccus. Okay. So if you are talking about the plural, PL is nothing but plural. That means if there are main, so many, so it is actually called as cocci. Then we have rod-shaped bacillus. So if you are talking it as one like many like bacilli, and the comma shaped can also be seen, which is called as vibrium, and the spiral, which is actually called as spirillum or spirilla. So these kinds of bacteria were also been classified based on their morphological character. Some of the bacteria are also autotroph. That means they normally synthesize their own food from the inorganic substance. Okay, so this is also inorganic substance, and they may be photosynthetic autotrophs or chemosynthetic autotrophs. This is very important. Photosynthetic autotrophs means they are able to produce their own food because there is a photosynthetic pigment, that is chlorophyll is actually present. Or even there might be a chemical pigment. So that is chemosynthetic autotrophs. That means they are going to utilize the inorganic components as an food, or and they get their food or nutrients from that. So the vast majority of the bacteria are heterotrophs, that is, they depend on other organisms or dead organisms, dead decaying materials or matters, okay, for their food. So that is, they also bacteria sometimes they also act as a decomposers. Next is in the bacteria, you will actually that this kingdom Monera, you will see some of the different again subclasses like archibacterians. So these bacterians are the especially they have been found since they live in some of the most harsh habitats, such as very harsh habitat, such as extreme salty areas. So those animals like bacteria which normally lives in the extreme salt areas are called as holophiles. Whereas if they are found in the hot spring areas, then they are called as thermoacidophils. And if they are found in the marshy areas, then they are called as methanogens. Okay. So here the archaebacterians differs from the other bacterians as it has the different cell walls, because in order to sustain in those harshy environment, they had their they have developed a different cell wall. Okay. And their future is responsible for the survival in that extreme condition. Then we have another thing, that is methanogens, like though bacteria which normally live in marshy areas, such as they normally present in the gut of several ruminant animals, such as cow and buffalo, and they are also responsible for the production of the methane gas, that is the biogas, okay, which has been from the dung of the animal. So that can be used as a biogas, okay. And it can be used as a household purpose and many other purpose by the human beings. Then we have a eubacteria. So eubacteria is actually characterized by the presence of the rigid cell wall, and it is motile and flagellated. That means it normally shows the momentum. Then we have one of the example is cyanobacteria, which is actually a blue-green algae. Okay, so they actually have chlorophyll. So therefore, they are similar to the green plant, and also they are autotrophic in nature. That is, they perform photosynthesis. That means they are able to prepare their own food. Then these cyanobacterians are actually unicellular bacteria, and they can be found in the colony, that is colonial or filamentous individually, and they are mostly they are either freshwater or marine water, or they are also the terrestrial algae. Okay, so if you are seeing actually in a colonial form, so they are generally surrounded by a gelatinous sheath. Okay, and they often forms a blooming in the polluted water bodies. Blooms and sense it shows some colorations in the polluted water bodies. Some of these organisms can also fix the atmospheric nitrogen. Okay, in a specialized cell that is called as heterocytes. Can you see here we have a specialized cells called as heterocysta. So these heterocysta, okay, they are the specialized cell which is able to fix the atmospheric nitrogen. Okay. Example for them is Nostack and Anabenia. So this is all about the eubacteria. And another thing is, I told you like autotrophic, and there are some bacteria which are also shows the chemosynthetic autotrophic. That means they normally form like they are going bacteria. They are going to oxidize the various inorganic substances. That is, they are going to utilize the inorganic substances such as nitrates or nitrites, ammonia, and then they are by utilizing those, they are going to they're going to release the energy in the form of ATP production. And these chemosynthetic, okay, they play a very important role in the nutrient recycling, like nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, sulfur recycling, right? So these heterotrophic bacteria are most abundant in nature, and the majority of them acts as a decomposers. Many of them have a significant impact in the humans also. Like there are other organisms, bacteria, that helps in making the curd from the milk, then produce the antibiotics, fix nitrogen in the leguminous plants, leguminous fruits, nodules, and many other functions can be seen. And some of them are pathogenic in nature. That means they causes damage, harmful diseases to many organisms like human beings, animals, as well as crops, insects, and all. So yeah, this for example, cholera that you can see, and typhoid, tetanus, uh, then citrus canker. So they are actually well-known diseases which are being caused by different bacteria. Clear? Then there are, what about the reproduction mode of this bacteria? Either they go with the majorly by fission mode. Sometimes if there is any favorable condition can be observed, then they produce spores formation. Okay. So this is one thing. So, and that spores will get developed into an individual bacteria. So fission is nothing but, so one bacteria, that is the parent bacteria, so it is going to cut itself into two equal daughter cell, and that is going to develop into an individual bacteria. Then what is the kind of genetic material that can be seen in the bacteria? It has, so when it comes to a sexual reproduction mode, it adopts a primitive type of DNA transfer from one bacteria to the another bacteria. So again, in a bacteria, DNA is a genetic material. Single stranded DNA will be always a genetic material. So bacteria also has plasmids. Okay, if it has cell wall, cell membrane, this is the genetic material DNA, and it will also be having the plasmids anyhow. So then one of the example is mycoplasm of the organisms. So they normally lack what? Cell walls. So they are smallest living cells that can known to survive even without the oxygen. So many mycoplasm, they are actually pathogenic in animals as well as plants. That is, they normally causes diseases in animals as well as plants. And this point is also very important. And this point is also very important about this bacterial reproduction. Okay. So they normally adopt a primary type of DNA transfer from one bacteria to the another bacteria. So we have our next kingdom, that is kingdom protista. So can you say something about the kingdom protista now? So kingdom protista are actually, what do you say that? They are single-celled eukaryotes and are being placed under the protista. All the single-celled eukaryotes, right? So they are being placed under the kingdom protista, but they are very abundant, okay? And the abundancy of this kingdom are still not defined well. So members of this protista are primarily, they are aquatic in nature, and the kingdom form a link between the other dead, link with the others dealing with the plant, animal, and fungi. Being one of the eukaryotes, the protista cell body contains well-defined, you can actually see the nucleus, and other membrane-bounded organelles can also be seen or studied. Some have flagella or cilia. Okay, so flagella or some will also be having the cilia. Then the protista, they are going to reproduce asexually as well as sexually by the process involved in cell fusion as well as the zygote formation. So this is all about its reproduction mode. So again, here you can again see some of the subclasses of this. So one is chrysophytes, cryophytes, yes, cryophytes. So what happens in the cryophytes are, these groups includes the diatoms, which are actually the golden algae because of the decimites, or they can also called as decimites because it is somewhat golden in color. So they are found in the freshwater as well as in the marine water environment also. So they are very important microscopic, and they are very, very microscopic. That means they can be seen only through the microscope, and they actually float in the water current. Okay, passively floats in the water current. Most of them are photosynthetic in nature. When I'm talking about these diatoms, okay, the cell wall forms a two thin overlapping shell. So just like, have you seen the soap box? So yeah, so there will be like two cells which will be overlapping with each other. So in a form of soap box. So the wall are embedded with silica. That is, wall is actually made up of silica, and thus it is, the walls are very rough and tough. Thus the diatoms after the death, they are being left behind. Large amount of the cellular walls will be deposited in their habitat, so in the soil and all. So their accumulation of a billion years of those diatoms, deposition is actually called as diatomaceous earth. So this is also very important, diatomaceous earth. So being that gritty, the soil has been gritty in sense being so rough and tough, the soil where they got deposited, right? So they have been used in polishing, filtering of the oil, and syrups filters also they have been used. So the diatoms are the they are actually called as the chief products in the oceans. Then dinoflagellates. So in the dinoflagellates, these organisms are mostly marine and are photosynthetic in nature. See, when you're talking about dinoflagellates, they appear yellow, green, brown, blue, as well as red, depending upon the pigments which is already present on the cell. So the cell wall has a stiff cellulose plate on the surface, outside the surface. For example, like this. So I'll actually see kind of this thing, that is it has a stiff cellulose plate on the outer surface, which is again very hard and all. So then the most of them have two flagella. So that is, it will be having how many flagella? Most of them will be having two flagella like this. Okay, so one lies longitude and the other transverse in the furrow between the wall plate. That means one will be longitude and another thing, will be between in the two, that is wall plate, furrow between the wall plates. Then very often, if you see the red dinoflagellates, for example, uh, Gynoaxilla. So they actually undergo a rapid multiplication, that is cell division. As a result, what happens? The sea appear to be red in color, like red tide and all. And they also release some of the toxic. Okay, so since they're large number and all of them they release toxic, so these toxics may even kill the other marine animals such as fishes also. Clear? The next one is we have is euglenoids. So what about euglenoids? Yes. So when I'm talking about the euglenoids, make sure that they are the freshwater organisms found in the stagnant waters also. Okay. And instead of cell wall, they have a protein-rich layer that is actually called as, so protein-rich layer which is called as pelicil. Okay, which makes their body flexible. And they're somewhat flippery in structure also. They have two flagella. One is very shorter flagella will also be present, and another one is which is very long flagella. Okay, so they have the ability to produce their own food, that is photosynthetic in the presence of sunlight. And if there is any absence of sunlight or derived of sunlight, what happens? They act as an heterogeneous in nature, that is they heterogeneous by predating on the other smaller organisms. They eat upon other smaller organisms and then they survive. So the pigment of the euglenoids are identical to those present in the higher plants also, like euglena. Clear? Example is euglena. That means the pigments which is you will find as in the euglenoids, right? You'll also see them in the higher group. That is the euglena. Next thing, slim modes. So coming to the slim modes, what happens? Slim modes are the saprophytic parasites. That means uh, you can actually see the body moves along the decaying twin and the leaves. So if there are any decaying substance, what happens? Their body moves to along the decaying twigs and leaves, engulfed this. That means they normally engulf the organic matter. Under suitable condition, what happens? They form an aggregation. That is, so if you see them as a slim moles, right? So they are going to, under some condition, what happens? They are going to aggregate each other, okay, aggregate towards each other. And this is actually called as yeah, plasmodiferous differs. So aggregation, that is actually called as plasmodium. Okay, so later on what happens? It is going to grow and spread over the several feet like this. It is going to spread for several feet. And during unfavorable condition, what happens? This plasmodium, it differentiate and forms a fruity body bearing a spores at the tip. So at the tip, what you will see is you're going to see the spores, fruity body, spores bearing. So these spores processes what? True walls. Okay. So they're extremely resistant and they can survive in a very adverse environmental condition for a very long years, for many several years. Okay. Under unfavorable condition. And once the adverse condition happens, what happens? The spores, they get dispersed by the air current and reaches somewhere else, and there it starts going to develop as the individual slim modes. So the next one is protozoa. So protozoas are actually heterotrophic. That is, normally they depend on other organisms, like they are the predators or the parasitic mode. So they are believed to be primitive relations with the animals. There are four major groups of this protozoans. What are those groups? So one is amoeboid protozoans. The second one is flagellated protozoans, ciliated, and sporozoans. See, in amoeboidal sporozoans, what happens? These organisms live in a fresh water as well as sea water and in the moist soil also you can see them. So they move and they are going to capture the prey by putting out their pseudopodia, that is nothing but false feet, as an amoeba. See, for example, if you look this as an amoeba, okay, if you look this as an amoeba, so you can actually see the pseudopodia surroundings here. So false food as an amoeba. So what happens is it is going to catch the prey with the help of this pseudopodia, that is false feet. Okay, and in most of the marine form, it has the silica shell on its surrounding. And example is amoeba are basically example is entamoeba, right? They're actually the parasitic mode. Then we have the flagellated protozoans. In flagellated protozoans, so what happens? They are either free living or they are parasitic in nature. So they are flagella. The parasitic forms causes what? Diseases such as sleeping sickness. Example, trypanosoma, trypanosoma. Okay, so this is an example which is for the flagellated protozoans. So it causes what? Sleeping sickness. Then we have ciliated protozoans. They are aquatic in nature, actively moving organisms because of the presence of thousands of cilia which has been surrounded around it. Okay, so they have the cavity, that is layer, that actually opens the outside of the cell surface. Okay. Then there is a coordination momentum of the rows of the cilia. That is, since cilia that you can see that have been surrounded around the body. So there will be a coordination while momentum and all. So in such a way that the water leaned with food to be treated into the gut. So whatever the food which comes through the water, right, that will get into the gut through that opening outside the cell surface, and once it is utilized it will come out again. So example, paramecium. Paramecium. Okay, then the last one is sporozoans. So they includes diverse organisms that have an infectious spores-like stage in their life cycle. That means the most of them, like if you take up the malarial parasite, that is Plasmodium, so which causes malaria. So in these, what happens? You can actually see a spores-like structure during its life cycle. So which causes malaria disease, which has a staggering efforts effects on the human population. Okay, so these are about what? Sporozoids. So this is all about the yes, they're all about the protozoan and all over the kingdom Protista. So the next we have is kingdom fungi. So this normally called fungi or fungi, something pronunciation like that. So what almost matters is more than pronunciation, spelling matters. Just have this thing in your mind. So kingdom fungi, it normally constitutes a kingdom of heterotrophic organisms. That is nothing but they normally depend on other organisms for their food, nutrients, and all. So they show a great diversity in morphology as well as their habitat, like the places where they normally live. So they normally show a greater diversity also, right? So the common mushrooms that we eat and toadstools are also fungi. Basically, that means that you normally like the mushrooms, right? So they all comes under the kingdom fungi. So white spots that normally seen on the mustard leaves are also somewhat the parasitic fungi. And another thing is even the bread molds and all, like you'll see the growth, right? Somewhat blackish growth. So they are also the fungi. Some unicellular fungi, like yeast, they are being used as an economic importance, like making the bread and beer. And some of the fungi, like other fungi and all, they even causes diseases in plants and animal, like fungal diseases, and even like wheat rust causing the Punicea, which is actually an important example. And some of the other examples, like you can also use them as an antibiotics, like penicillium is also a fungi. So from the penicillium, we normally derive or we normally make an antibiotics. So then they're volatile, that is, they're distributed everywhere: air, water, soil, animals, on the animals and plants. So they prefer to grow in major thing is they normally prefer the warmth and humid climate. Okay, humid place, humid climate. So that condition they normally prefer to grow. So yeast, exception of the yeast, which is unicellular, fungi are almost filamentous in structure. So, whereas yeast, if you see, they are normally unicellular, that is single celled. Okay. So, where fungi are filamentous, they have their own complex structure of body and all. So, their body consists of long, slender thread like structure called as hype, like something like this. Okay. So the network of hyphae is actually called as mycelium. Anyhow, so some hyphae are continuous tube filled with nucleated cytoplasm here, something like this. So they are actually called as coinocytic hyphae. Okay. This is also very important point. Others have the septa or cross wall in their hyphae. So the cell wall of the fungi are composed of the chitin or polysaccharides. That is, the cell wall is either made up of the chitin or the polysaccharide. The basically their cell walls are made up of. So most of the fungi, as I told, are heterotrophic in nature, and they absorb, soluble organic matter from the dead, decaying substances, and hence they are called as saprophytes. Okay, fungi are basically what? They are saprophytes. So they normally depend on, saprophytes are nothing but they normally depend on living plants and animals. If the fungi normally depends on the living plants and animals, then they are called as what? Parasites. Okay. So they can also live as a symbiotic, that is, in association with the other organisms, where they give mutual benefits normally takes place, like in association with algae as lichens, and with roots of higher plants as mycorrhiza. So this is also very important. That is, fungi normally shows a symbiotic association with the algae as lichens and with the roots of higher plants as a mycorrhiza. Okay. So coming to the reproduction mode, they actually take place in vegetative, where vegetative mode of reproduction goes with fragmentation, fission, and budding process. So if it is sexual mode of reproduction, obviously through the formation of spores, and the spores are called as conidia or sporangiospore or zoospore. Okay. And sexual reproduction is also by the oospores, then ascospores and basidospores. Okay, so these are the types of spores which are being they function for this sexual reproduction as well as asexual reproduction. So if I'm talking about the asexual reproduction, it is by the spore formation, that is conidia, sporangiospore and zoospores. They all come, these spores are actually generated for the asexual reproduction. So if it is a sexual reproduction, it is actually by the oospores, then ascospores and basidiospores. Okay. And the various spores are also produced in the distinct structure. They are actually called as fruiting bodies. So these are the things that one need to have remember in the mind. So the sexual cycle involves the basically three steps, like fission of the protoplasm between the two motile or non-motile gametes called as plasmogame. So one question like what is plasmogame? Fission in sexual cycle. So fission of protoplasm between, that is nothing but fusion, that is if there are two motile or non-motile gametes, okay, so there is a fusion of fusion, not fission, it's fusion. Fission is dividing, fusion is uh, combining, okay, so or fusing. So yeah, fusion or fusing of protoplasm between two motile or non-motile gametes called as plasmogame. Then another step happens is fusion of two nuclei called as karyogame. Then meiosis in zygote resulting in haploid spore. So first thing what happens, there will be a fusion between two motile or non-motile gametes. So that is actually called as plasmogame. And when the fusion happens, the nuclei which is present, right, they get fused, which is actually called as karyogame. After that, the meiosis will happen as a result of zygote, okay, that is zygote form. After the zygote formation, meiosis will happen, which results in the haploid spores. So this is the cycle, sexual cycle that involves in the fungi. So when a fungi reproduce sexually, as I told, two haploid hyphae of the compatible mating time comes, like that means two haploid hyphae of the compatible mating type, so they come and fuse together, okay, this is one point. And in some fungi what happened, the fusion of two haploid cells immediately result in the diploid cells, that is once the haploid cells get fused immediately, that is going to result in the diploid cells. And in other fungi what happens, so you are going to see the intervening the dikaryotic stage, that is if there are basically, if you see two haploid are that, so they get fused together into two nuclei per cell. So in one cell you will actually see the fusion, like two nuclei will be seen. So such condition is actually called as dikaryon, and the phase is called as dikaryophase of the fungi. Okay, so later what happens, the parental nuclei then they are going to fuse together, becoming the diploid. So in one cell, what happened immediately after the fusion diploid, it will have two haploid cells immediately going to become the diploid. But in some fungi, what happens? So there will be an interval of time. That is, once two haploid, even though if they fuse together, so in the cell, as a result, you will find a cell. So, but in the cell, you will be seeing two nuclei. That is two different parental nuclei. So after that, you will see that these two nuclei, they are going to fuse together. Okay. And after fusing, once the parental nuclei gets fused, it becomes what? Diploid stage. That is 2n stage. Okay. Then the fungi forms a fruity body in which the reduction division occurs, leading to the formation of the haploid spores. So from the fruity body itself, spores will emerge. And the morphology of this mycelium, mode of spore formation, and the fruit body from and the formation of the fruit body from the basis of the division of the this kingdom can also be seen. Then there are again certain divisions that we can actually see in the fungi kingdom. So first one is phycomycetes. They are basically aquatic habitat, and they are also found on some of the decaying wood in the moist and damp places, or in an obligate parasite on the, they act as an obligate parasite on the plant. That is, they normally live on the plant body, and from plant body, they are going to extract the food. Then this mycelium, the mycelium is aseptic, and Coniocytes. That means asexual reproduction takes place by zoospores, which are actually motile in nature, or by non-motile, that is aplanospores. Okay, so these spores are, this is again very important, and these spores are endogenously produced in the sporangium. So what happens is these spores are actually produced in the sporangium part, and zygospores is actually formed by the fusion of these two gametes, that is male and female gametes. So since it is an asexual, what happens if there are any gametes that fuse leads to the zygospores. So the gametes are similar in morphology. So that's why we normally called as isogamous. Or if they are dissimilar in morphology, we normally called as angiogamous or oogamous. Clear? So that is you'll see in a sexual mode of reproduction. Some common examples are mucor, rhizopus, which normally you'll see on the bread mold, right, which I have already mentioned in the earlier. Then albugo, which is a parasitic fungi, which normally you'll see on the mustard, as I have said in the earlier slide. The next one is ascomycetes. Ascomycetes are commonly called as sac fungi. So, and they are mostly, they are multicellular. Example, penicillium, or rarely unicellular, like yeast. If you take an example, yeast, uh, Saccharomyces. So these are an examples for ascomycetes. So they are sapriotic, like they act as a decomposers, and parasitic also, and they also grow on the dung part. Dung is nothing but the waste of animals. Okay, so mycelium is branched and septate. Then asexual reproduction, the asexual spores are actually conidia, produced exogenously outside the body on the special mycelium, which is called as conidiospores. Okay, so conidia on germination, they are going to produce the mycelium. So sexual spores are called as acrospores, which are produced endogenously in sac-like structure. Okay, so so that is actually called as asci. So they are arranged in different types of fruit body. They are called as ascocarps. Okay, and some of the examples are aspergillus. Then we have clavicus and neurospora. So neurospora is used extremely in the biochemical as well as in the genetic work. So this is another very important thing. So many members like the morels and truffles are edible. That is, you can normally eat them and are considered even delicious. Okay. Then we have basidomycetes. So coming to the basidomycetes, they are commonly, they are called as uh, mushrooms or bracket fruits and puffballs are all comes under the basidomycetes. So they normally grow in soil on loops and tree trunks and all. So you can also see they also in living plant bodies as a parasite also you can see them growing. So such as some of the example are rust as well as smuts. Okay. Then this mycelium is actually branched and they're septate. So when it comes to asexual spores formation, they are generally not found. But vegetative reproduction by fragmentation is not more common in the basidiomycetes. So the sexual organs are absent here, but plasmogamy is brought about by fusion of two, like vegetative or somatic cells of different strains, like different beings or different individuals or the genotype. So the resultant, what happens? The resultant structure will be dikaryotic, which ultimately give rise to the basidium. Okay, so this is another point. And karyogamy and karyogamy is nothing but fusion of two nuclei, parental nuclei, and meiosis takes place in the basidium, producing four basidospores. Okay, so one will be producing what? four basidospores, and they are exogenous produced by the basidium. So this basidium or basidia are arranged in fruiting bodies. They are called as basidiocarpus. So they are what they are called as. They are called as basidiocarpus. Some common examples are some of the examples are agaricus, that is mushroom, astraga, that is smut, as well as Puccinia, that is rust fungus. The next we have as deuteromycetes, which is again a kind of fungus. So commonly they are called as imperfect fungi because only asexual or vegetative phase of this can be seen. That is only we know. Okay, asexual and vegetative phase are just we know that. So it is also possible that the asexual and vegetative stage have been given one name, like both has been given only one name. But sexual stage, it has a another, the place which is being placed in another classes anyhow. So later, but you should just remember that it is an imperfect fungi. Okay, so why it is actually called as imperfect fungi? Because the sexual or vegetative phase of these fungi are known. Only vegetative phase as well as asexual phases. Now we have no idea clue about sexual phases and all. So later, when the linkages were established, the fungi were correctly identified and moved out from the deuteromycetes. Okay, so this is another thing. Then what happened, that means there were before, some of asexual mode were also been placed and they call them as deuteromycetes, but because of the linkage were established, cross linkaging and their identification, later on they were moved to the other moved out from this deuteromycetes. So one perfect stage of the member of this deuteromycetes were discovered. They were often moved to ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. That means one, there was a very perfect that the sexual stage of this member were actually discovered, but later on, by linkaging, by going even depth, they were late shifted or moved to the acetomycetes or basidiomycetes. Okay, based on their similarities. Then therefore we don't know the sexual stage of it. Then deuteromycetes reproduce only by asexual spores called as conidia. So then the mycelium is septed and they're branched up. So some members of these are parasitic or saprophytic, okay, while a large number of them are acts as a decomposers of little or help in basically the mineral cycle. That means they normally helps in balancing some of the mineral cycle. Examples are alternaria, then coleotrochium and trichidoderma. Tricho, trichoderma. Clear? So we have the next kingdom, that is kingdom plant or plant kingdom, which is very important kingdom. So they includes all eukaryotic chlorophyll containing organisms that are called as plants. So there are other few members which acts as a partially heterotropic, such as insectivorous plants or parasites, like examples like bladderwort and Venus flytrap. They are some of the examples for the insectivorous plants. And Cuscuta is actually a kind of parasitic. They normally depend on other organisms for their nutrients. Like they grow on the other tree, long, large trees and all. So the plant cell has an eukaryotic structure with prominent chloroplast and cell wall mainly made up of the cellulose. This is important part. So plant A includes algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms, which you are going to learn, which I have already discussed, but in the revision part, you're going to learn in the next plant kingdom. So life cycle of plant actually goes with two distinct phases. One is the diploid sporophytic phase and the haploid gametophytic phase. So there you can actually see an alternation of generation with each other. That is the length of haploid and diploid phases. The length of from the the lives like from going from the diploid sporophyte and to the haploid gametophyte. So this length of haploid and diploid phases, and when these phases are free living or depend on others, okay, among different groups in plant. So that varies in different group in plants, and this phenomenon is actually called as alternation of generation, which is again very important. And in depth, I'm again going to explain you in the plant kingdom. The next one is animal kingdom. So this kingdom is actually characterized by the heterotrophic eukaryotic organisms that are multicellular, and their cell wall is also they lack in cellular cell wall. Okay, the cell lack cell walls. So they directly or indirectly depends on plants for their food. So they digest their food in a internal cavity and store reserved food in a form of glycogen or fat. So their mode of nutrients is actually holozoic. That is, they normally indigest the food. Then they follow a definite growth pattern and grow into adult, and that have a definite shape and size and structure. So higher form shows elaborative sensory organs, and you also see a neuromotor mechanism, that is nothing but your brain mechanism. Most of them are capable of locomotion, that is momentum, and basically you'll see only sexual reproduction. So that is actually done by the copulation of male and female, followed by what? Embryonic development. So that's the next concept, or the last concept is viruses, viroids, prions, and lichens. So these are the organisms that have been placed separately. That means they are not included in the five kingdom system of classification. So what might be the major reason is that the most of this like viruses are, they do not find a place in a classification since they are not considered a true living. So if we understand living as those organisms, we normally see a very well-defined cell structure and its functions and all, which cannot be seen in the viruses. So they are basically non-cellular organisms that are characterized by having an um inert crystalline structure outside the living cell. So basically, what happens is they act as both living and non-living. That means when they are outside the living cell, they act as a non-living beings. Okay, they do not show any functions. They totally behave as if they are non-living during favorable condition. That is, once these viruses they get into the host. Okay, so that becomes a favorable condition to them, then you will see an active reproduction and all. So that's why they have been placed separately. And once they are infecting a cell, they take over the mechanism of that host cell. That means it starts controlling the entire cell structure and all, and then they start actively replicating that with those help. Okay, so and as an end, what it does is it is going to kill the host. So viruses, yeah. So this is one point. The next one is the viruses means vernoms or the poisonous fluid. So the word virus is nothing but the venoms or the poisonous fluid. That means actually uh, Levanovsky was the very first scientist. Like in 1892, he recognized a certain microbes as a causative agent of the mosaic disease of the tobacco. So that these were been found to be a very smaller than even a bacteria. Like compared to the bacterial size, they were found to be very smaller because they even pass through those bacteria-proof filters. That is the one filters which even holds the bacteria, so even these organisms were able to pass through those minute pores. So later on, M.W. Bezneker in 1898, he demonstrated another one where he has extracted some fluid from the infected plant of the tobac, and which causes the infection to the LDS plant. And later on, he found a pathogen there. So he named it as the viruses and called the fluid as the contagium vivum fluid. That is nothing but the fluid which is infectious living fluid. So later on, Stanley in 1985, he showed the structure of the virus by where he actually did through the crystallization, and the crystals normally consist of largely of the proteins basically, and they are inert outside their specific host cell, so they become inactive in the outside the host cell, and once they get into their specific host cell, they becomes more active. So they are basically obligated parasites. Then this is a exact structure that you can see the tobacco mosaic model. So anyhow, see, in addition to the proteins, these viruses also contains a genetic material that could either be the RNA or it could be the DNA. So no viruses contain that means none of the virus are going to contain both RNA as well as DNA together. A virus is actually a nucleoprotein, and the genetic material will always be infectious. In general, if I want to talk about the virus, they normally infect the plant. So the viruses which normally infect the plants will be having always single RNA, and the viruses which are going to infect the animals, will either be having single or double stranded RNA or double stranded DNA. This is very important point. So in general, if the plant has been infected by a virus, then that virus will be having only single-stranded RNA. So if this viruses that infects animals will either be having single or double-stranded RNA or double-stranded DNA. Right? So the bacterial viruses or bacteriophage is nothing but this is the figure. So the viruses which normally infect the bacteria. Okay. So here bacteria is a pathogen that we know, but there are some other organisms which are actually going to infect the bacteria itself. So those viruses which is going to infect the bacteria, and later on it is going to complete its life cycle in the host bacteria, is actually called as bacteriophages. Right. So obviously it will be having double stranded DNA viruses. The protein code called capsid. So you can actually there will be a protein code which is called as capsid, made up of a smaller subunit called as, you can see here the capsids, which are actually made up of the smaller subunits that are called as capsomeres, which actually protects the nucleic acid, okay, which is present in the virus. Then these capsomeres are arranged in the helical or polyhedral, geometric form that you can actually see here. So in this way, they are being arranged. Then they causes diseases like diseases like mumps and the smallpox, herpes, and influenza kind of diseases, and AIDS, which is most popularly seen in humans, right? Is also caused by the virus. So in plants, the symptoms can be like mosaic formation, a liquid kind of formation, or leaf rolling. Then curly structures can be seen in the leaf, then yellowish and vein clearing. Okay, dwarfing, that means early, fall down of the leaves from the plant, and stunned growth, that is abnormal growth, can be seen in the plant. So that means that might be the plant has been infected by the virus. Then coming to the other thing, that is viroids. So viroids, when compared to viruses, they are again very small. So in 1971, Dynia, he discovered a new infectious agent that was very smaller than the viruses, and which actually caused the potato spindle tuber diseases. Okay. So it was found to be a free RNA. That means it lacks protein coat, outer covering, that has actually been found in the viruses. Hence, it was actually named as the viroid. So then another thing is this protein RNA of the viroid was of low molecular weight. So this is another thing. So this viroid is even way smaller than the viruses. The next one is the prions. So coming to the prions, in modern medicine, if you say there are certain infections that is related to neurological diseases were found, actually, well, the transmission of certain, causing agents because of the abnormal folding proteins. So what happens is these prions are even way smaller than the virus and viroids. Okay. So their agents were called as prions. So the most notable diseases which is being caused by the prions are bovine spongiform encephalopathy. That is nothing but BSE. Okay. So which is actually called as mad cow disease in the cattle. And also you can see the same thing in the human beings. It is actually caused by uh, analogous variant, that is car, Karchkov diseases in the humans will be seen. So what it is going to do is it is going to affect the your neurons. Okay, so where it is going to lead to the abnormal foldings of the protein, so which leads to the neurological diseases. So the last one is lichens. So they are actually symbiotic association. That is, they mutually useful association between the algae as well as fungi. So the algae component is known as the phycobiont, and the fungi component is actually called as mycobiont. So which are autotrophic and heterotropic in nature. That is, they're able to prepare its own food as well as they depend on other organisms also. So algae prepare food where from the fungi, and fungi, what happens? It normally provide the shelter and absorbs the mineral nutrients, right, and water from its partner. So closely in their association, that is on a leech lichen in nature. One would, so it is actually, you can actually see a kind of lichen in nature. So where one would never imagine that they had two different organisms within them. So lichens are very good pollutant indicators. Like they do not grow in a pollutant area. So there, normally wherever you are seeing an association with the fungi as well as algae, so lichens are also present. So they are also being placed separately. Without these both, the lichens will not be able to grow. So that means they are closely in their association with the lichens as well as in lichens that you will be seeing only that. So this is all about the other organisms which have been placed separately from or excelled from this five kingdom system of classification. And this is all about the biological classification.